It's exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on May 25th, 1996. If you were standing on the edge of the California Polytechnic State University campus in San Luis Obispo right now, you wouldn't be able to see your own hand in front of your face. A massive, heavy fog has rolled in off the Pacific, turning the eucalyptus trees and the red brick dormitories into ghosts. The Memorial Day weekend has just started, and while most of the students have already packed up and headed home to see their families, the air around an off-campus house on Crandall Way is still thumping with the bass of a late-night party. In the middle of this grey haze, a 19-year-old freshman named Kristin Smart is struggling. She is barely holding it together, leaning her entire weight on a fellow student named Tim Davis. She is wobbly, her speech is coming out as a slurred mumble, and she is shivering in the damp coastal air. Another student, Cheryl Anderson, is walking on her other side, trying to keep Kristin from collapsing onto the cold pavement. They are trying to get her back to the dorms, back to her bed, where she'll be safe. Then, a shadow moves out of the darkness. A young man named Paul Flores, a 20-year-old student with a reputation that most girls on campus already know to steer clear of, walks up to the group. He doesn't ask if they need a hand. He just steps in and says he's got her. He tells Tim and Cheryl that his own dorm, Santa Lucia Hall, is right on the way to Kristin's room in Muir Hall. He tells them they should go home and get some sleep. He promises he will make sure Kristin gets behind her door safely. As Tim and Cheryl peel off into the mist, they look back one last time. They see Paul with his arm wrapped tight around Kristin's waist, basically dragging her into the shadows. That image, the 19-year-old girl with the bright future being led into the fog by the only man who volunteered to help, is the last time anyone other than her killer would ever see Kristin Smart alive. She didn't just vanish, she was taken. And for the next 27 years, her face would become a permanent fixture on billboards along Highway 101, a reminder of a secret that a whole community refused to let die. Today, we are going deep into the case that changed California law forever. We're talking about the massive failures of the campus police, the secret buried beneath a concrete deck for 2 decades, and the high-stakes legal battle that finally reached a conclusion in late 2025. Welcome to Cold Case Files. I'm your host, and if you believe that the passage of time should never be a shield for a predator, then you are in the right place. Before we get into the heart-pounding details of that night on Crandall Way, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. We are a community dedicated to finding answers for the families the world tried to forget, and your support is what keeps these investigations moving forward. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city and state in the comments. I love seeing how far this community reaches. To understand how Kristin Smart became a face on a billboard, you have to understand who she was. She wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, a sister, and a girl who was just starting to figure out who she wanted to be. Kristin Denise Smart was born on February 20th, 1977, in Augsburg, West Germany. Her parents, Stan and Denise, were both educators who taught the children of American military families stationed overseas. Eventually, the family moved back to the States, settling in Stockton, California. Kristin was a tall, striking girl, nearly 6 feet tall, with a warm smile and a personality that her family described as adventurous and full of life. She loved art, she loved to dance, and she had a stubborn streak that made her parents both proud and a little nervous. In the fall of 1995, she headed off to Cal Poly to major in communications, but like many freshmen, the transition was rough. She struggled with the blondness of the campus culture. She missed her family, and just days before she disappeared, she had called her mother, Denise, in tears. She begged to come home. She told her mum she was ready to drop out because she felt like she didn't fit in. Denise encouraged her to stick it out just a little longer to at least get through her freshman year. That's a conversation that has probably played on a loop in Denise Smart's head for nearly 30 years. The night of May 24th, 1996, was supposed to be a celebration. The end of the term was in sight. Kristin got ready in her room in Muir Hall, putting on a grey half t-shirt, black surfing shorts, and a pair of red Puma athletic shoes. She didn't take her purse. She didn't take her money. She didn't even take her keys or her identification. She left it all sitting on her desk, assuming she'd be back in a few hours. Before she left, her friend Margarita Campos handed over her own set of keys so Kristin could get back into the building later. Kristin and Margarita headed out to find a party. They were just looking for the typical college experience: music, friends, and maybe a few beers. They eventually found their way to a house at 135 Crandall Way. It was an unofficial frat house, the kind of place where the beer flows from kegs and the music is loud enough to rattle the windows. Witnesses at the party later said that Kristin seemed to be enjoying herself at first, but as the night went on, her behavior changed. She appeared heavily intoxicated. Some people even thought she might have been roofied or drugged. A fellow student named Trevor Bolter would later testify that she didn't just seem drunk, she seemed druggy, like she was totally out of it, spacey and unstable on her feet. At one point, she fell down in the middle of the party with a loud thud. Paul Flores was right there. He fell with her, laughing, and witnesses remembered them drinking together at the bar area. For Paul, this was a moment he had been waiting for. For months, his classmates had noticed him staring intently at Kristin. Her friends thought he was creepy. He would show up in the common area of her dorm for no reason, just watching her. Kristin told her friends he made her feel uncomfortable. She had zero interest in him. But that night, in her vulnerable state, Paul saw his opening. By 2 a.m., the party was breaking up. Tim Davis, a junior who was helping with party management, found Kristin passed out face down on a neighbor's lawn. He couldn't just leave her there. The Central Coast gets cold at night, and she was barely dressed for the drop in temperature. Tim picked her up, put his arm around her waist, and started the long, uphill walk back to the dorms. That's when Paul Flores appeared out of the dark. He joined the group, volunteering himself to help hold up the wobbly and stumbling girl. Tim Davis later described her as being like a sack of potatoes. She was a dead weight. When they reached the intersection near the residence halls, the group began to split up. Tim lived in the opposite direction, so he handed Kristin over to Paul. Cheryl Anderson was still there, but Paul kept encouraging her to go home alone. He told her several times that she didn't need to stay, that he had everything under control. He even asked Cheryl for a kiss and a hug before she left. Advances she flatly rejected. Finally, Cheryl made Paul promise that he would walk Kristin all the way to her room. Paul gave his word. Cheryl turned and walked toward her own dorm, Sierra Madre Hall. In the silence of that foggy morning, Paul Flores was left alone with a girl who couldn't stand on her own 2 feet. He didn't take her to Muir Hall. He didn't keep his promise. Instead, the prosecution would later argue, he took her into the darkness of his own room in Santa Lucia Hall Room 128, and it was there that the freshman experience turned into a life-ending struggle. Think about the terror of those final moments. A young woman, far from home, incapacitated and unable to fight back, in the hands of a man who had been stalking her for months. But the most frustrating part of this story isn't just what happened in that room. It's what didn't happen in the days that followed. The campus police were about to make a series of blunders so massive that they would allow a killer to walk free for the next 25 years. When Sunday morning finally arrived, the heavy fog from Friday night had lifted, but a much darker cloud was beginning to settle over Muir Hall. Kristin's roommate, Crystal Teschendorf, walked back into their shared room after being away for the holiday weekend. She expected to see Kristin crashed out on her bed, maybe still nursing a hangover from the Crandall Way rager. Instead, she was met with a stillness that felt wrong from the second she turned the handle. Kristin's bed was perfectly made, not a single wrinkle in the sheets. Crystal looked around the small room and realized that nothing had changed since Friday night. Kristin's red backpack, the one she took everywhere with her, was sitting right there. Her purse was on the desk. Her identification and every cent of her money were still exactly where she had left them. For a college student in 1996, leaving your ID and your cash behind was a massive red flag. You didn't just go off campus or out of town without your wallet. It just didn't happen. Crystal and another friend, Margarita Campos, started knocking on doors. They checked the common areas. They asked anyone who was still on campus if they'd seen the tall, blonde freshman with the big smile. But everyone gave them the same answer: nothing. Nobody had seen her since the party. By Monday morning, the red alerts were screaming. Kristin's friends went to the Cal Poly University Police Department to report her missing. They expected sirens. They expected a search party. Instead, they were met with a wall of indifference. The officers told them they had to wait more than 24 hours to file a formal report because Kristin was an adult. They suggested that maybe she had just gone on a spontaneous vacation or was shacking up with some guy she met at the party. One of the incident reports filed by the campus police was particularly insulting. It said that Kristin didn't have many close friends and that she lived her life in her own way, not conforming to typical behavior. They were basically writing her off as a troubled girl who had pulled a disappearing act. They didn't see a victim. They saw a headache they didn't want to deal with. Because of this attitude, a 4-day window opened up. 4 days where the trail was still hot. 4 days where physical evidence was sitting in a dorm room just a few hundred yards away. And while the police were sitting on their hands, Paul Flores was busy. On the Monday after Kristin vanished, Paul showed up at the Santa Lucia Hall common room to play a game of 8-ball pool. A junior transfer student named Mario was there, and he noticed something immediately. Paul had a dark, purple bruise under his right eye. It was impossible to miss. Paul was also acting weird, nervous, and edgy. He usually had a pretty outgoing personality, but that day he was quiet, keeping his baseball cap pulled down in a very unusual way, like he was trying to hide his face. Mario asked him what happened to his eye. Paul's first answer was that he got elbowed during a basketball game, but when investigators later talked to Paul's friends, who were at that game, they said it never happened. Nobody saw Paul get hit. So, Paul changed his story. He told another person that he hit his head on the steering wheel of his Ford Ranger while he was trying to install a new car stereo. Then, in a later interview, he told a third version, that he had been pushed at a party. 3 different stories for one black eye. In the world of criminal investigation, a shifting story is the calling card of a liar. While Paul was busy making up fibs, as he later called them, the Smart family was entering their own personal version of hell. Denise Smart spent that Memorial Day weekend at a swim meet with her 2 younger kids, Matt and Lindsay. She was expecting a call from Kristin on Sunday. When the phone didn't ring, she felt a pit in her stomach. By Monday, May 27th, the campus police finally called the Smarts. But they weren't calling to say they were looking for Kristin. They were calling to ask if she was home in Stockton. Denise was frantic. She knew her daughter, and she knew Kristin would never just walk away from her life without her belongings. The Smarts tried to file a report with the local San Luis Obispo police, but they were told it was too early. They even reached out to the FBI, only to be told that the university police were in charge of the case. It was a bureaucratic nightmare where everyone was passing the buck while a killer was potentially scrubbing a crime scene. It wasn't until June 5th, 10 full days after Kristin disappeared, that the campus police finally treated her dorm room as a crime scene. But even then, they made a massive mistake. They didn't seal off Paul Flores' room in Santa Lucia Hall. They allowed him to stay there. They allowed him to pack up his things for the summer. By the time they actually got around to searching room 128, Paul was gone. He had moved out. The room had been thoroughly cleaned. But you can't always scrub away the scent of the dead. In late June, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office finally took the lead on the investigation. They brought in 4 different highly trained cadaver dogs, specialized animals that are trained to detect the microscopic scent of human decomposition. These dogs were the best in the business. They were brought into the Santa Lucia dormitory one by one. When the first dog, a canine named Heritage, was let into the hallway, he didn't hesitate. He bypassed dozens of other doors and went straight to room 128. He began scratching at the door and alerting his handler. When they let him inside, the dog went right to the mattress. He alerted on the corner of the bed frame. The investigators brought in a second dog. Same result. A third dog. Same result. Finally, a fourth dog named Gail LaRogue was brought in. She alerted on the same mattress and the same box spring cover. All four dogs, working independently, told the investigators the same thing. Someone had died in that room. The detectives seized the mattress and the box spring cover. They found a brownish stain that tested positive for blood. But in 1996, DNA technology was still in its infancy. When they ran the tests, the results were uninformative. They couldn't prove the blood was Kristin's, and they couldn't prove it was Paul's. In the eyes of the law back then, it wasn't enough for an arrest. Think about the frustration of the Smart family. They had 4 dogs pointing to a single room. They had a suspect with a black eye and 3 different stories. They had witnesses saying Paul was the last person seen with Kristin. But because there was no body, the district attorney felt the case was too thin. Paul Flores didn't just walk away from Cal Poly. He walked back into his life in Southern California as if nothing had happened. He moved to San Pedro, got a job, and started frequenting the local bars. For the next 25 years, he would be the only suspect in a case that refused to go away. But while the police were struggling to find a smoking gun, the community was starting to talk. People began to remember the creepy guy from the dorms. They remembered how he would lurk in the Muir Hall common area, even though he didn't live there. A student named Stephen Fleming later testified that he once walked into Kristin's room and saw Paul just standing there, a few feet inside the doorway, while Kristin sat at her desk looking incredibly uncomfortable. She didn't want him there. She was not okay with him following her. This wasn't a spontaneous vacation. This was a stalking that ended in a struggle. But without Kristin to tell her story, the truth was buried deep. And as the years turned into decades, it seemed like Paul Flores might actually get away with it. He had the power of silence, and he was using it to its full effect. We are just scratching the surface of the evidence that eventually brought Paul Flores down. If you're still with us, you know that the real story is often in the details the headlines miss. I want to hear from you. What time is it there as you're listening to this? Are you a late-night true crime binger or an early morning listener? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that the Smart family deserves the truth, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. As we move into the next section, we're going to look at the 20-year stalemate and the single piece of evidence, a simple earring that was found in a driveway and then vanished into police custody. This is where the investigation takes a turn from missing person to a full-blown battle for justice. While Paul Flores was blending into the sprawling crowds of Southern California, starting a fresh life as a free man, the Smart family was entering a silent, decades-long war. The 1990s were coming to a close, but for Stan and Denise Smart, time hadn't moved an inch since that foggy morning in May. They were stuck in a loop of searches, press conferences, and the crushing weight of unanswered questions. By the end of 1996, the Smarts realized that the criminal justice system was failing them. They decided to take the fight to civil court. They filed a $20 million wrongful death lawsuit against Paul Flores. It wasn't about the money they knew. Paul didn't have $20 million in his pocket. It was about the power of a subpoena. It was the only way they could force him into a room and make him talk. In February of 1997, Paul Flores sat across from the Smart family attorney, James Murphy, for a deposition. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Paul came prepared with a weapon of his own, the Fifth Amendment. He didn't just use it once or twice. He invoked his right to remain silent 27 times. Think about that. He wouldn't even confirm what color his eyes were. He wouldn't confirm he was a student at Cal Poly. He sat there with a blank expression, stonewalling every single attempt to find the truth. At one point, Murphy asked him point blank if he killed Kristin Smart. Paul's response? Total silence. It was a masterclass in evasion that left the Smarts feeling more hopeless than ever. The civil suit eventually stalled because, without a body or a confession, there was no preponderance of evidence to move forward. But while the legal system was hitting dead ends, the Flores family property in Arroyo Grande was whispering secrets. In the fall of 1996, a woman named Mary Lassiter moved into a rental house owned by Paul's mother, Susan Flores. Mary had no connection to the case, but she quickly realized she was living in the middle of a mystery. One afternoon, while she was washing her car in the driveway, she looked down and saw something glittering near the front tire. It was a single woman's earring. Mary picked it up and her heart nearly stopped. She had seen the missing person posters for Kristin Smart all over town. She recognized the jewelry immediately. It looked exactly like the necklace Kristin was wearing on those billboards. Mary did the right thing. She called the police and handed the earring over. She thought this was the smoking gun that would finally bring Kristin home. But then the unthinkable happened. The police lost it. They didn't tag it. They didn't log it into evidence. They just let a potential murder clue vanish into thin air. It is one of the most infuriating moments in the entire 27-year saga. How do you lose an earring found at the primary suspect's family home? The Smart family was gutted. It felt like the authorities were working against them. And the weirdness at Susan's house didn't stop there. Mary Lassiter later told investigators a story that sounds like something out of a horror movie. Every single morning, at exactly 4:20 a.m., she was woken up by a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the backyard. Beep, beep, beep. It sounded like a digital watch alarm. Mary went outside multiple times to find the source, but the backyard was almost entirely paved over with thick concrete. There were only two small sections where planter boxes had been cut into the cement. Mary realized the sound was coming from underneath the ground. The prosecution would later argue that this was Kristin's watch, a watch with an alarm set for an early morning shift or a workout beeping from inside a shallow grave. By the time the police actually brought a search warrant to Susan's house years later, the beeping had stopped. The battery had died, and the secret remained buried beneath the concrete. If you're finding this deep dive into the Smart case as intense as I am, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this is a story worth sharing. I want to check in with you. What time is it there as you're listening to this? Are you watching this in the middle of the day, or are you a late-night true crime binger? Let us know in the comments. We love knowing when our community is active. By 1998, the Smarts realized that if they couldn't get justice for Kristin in the courtroom, they would get it in the State House. They successfully lobbied for the Kristin Smart Campus Security Act. This law was a game changer. It forced every public college in California to stop playing games with missing person reports. It required them to have formal, written agreements with local police to ensure that if a student vanishes, the grown-up investigators are called in immediately. No more 4-day waits. No more spontaneous vacations. Kristin's name was now written into California law, but her body was still missing. In 2002, on the 6th anniversary of her disappearance, a judge officially declared Kristin Smart legally dead. It was a somber day in Stockton. Her parents held a memorial, not because they had closure, but because they needed to acknowledge the reality. Their daughter wasn't coming home for dinner. They were looking for a grave now. For over 20 years, the Kristin Smart case was a scar on the central coast of California. People talked about it in hushed tones at grocery stores and bars, but mostly it was just a face on a billboard. That all changed in September of 2019. A man named Chris Lambert, a local musician who was only 8 years old when Kristin vanished, decided he couldn't just pass by her poster anymore. He didn't have a badge. He didn't have a degree in journalism. He just had a decent microphone, a home office, and a lot of questions that the authorities hadn't answered. He started a podcast called Your Own Backyard. What began as a small project to see if he could help a grieving family find peace exploded into a global phenomenon, eventually racking up over 30 million downloads. But Lambert did more than just retell the story. He became a human magnet for the truth. He spent hundreds of hours sitting in Stan and Denise Smart's living room, earning their trust in a way that the police never quite could. He humanized Kristin, reminding the world she was a real person with a contagion-like laugh and a dream of seeing the world's architecture, not just a victim in a dusty file folder. As the podcast grew, something unexpected happened. People who had been silent for 25 years began to reach out. They weren't calling the police, they were calling Chris. One of those people was a woman named Jennifer Hudson. She shared a story that would eventually help put Paul Flores behind bars for the rest of his life. Hudson testified that back in 1996, when she was only 17, she was hanging out at a local skater's spot in Huasna. Paul Flores walked up to her group. At one point, a public service announcement came on the radio, asking for tips about Kristin Smart. According to Hudson, Paul's face changed. He got what she described as dead eyes. He leaned over and told her that Kristin was a bitch and a dick tease who had led him on. Then, he said he had taken care of her and buried her under an enclosure. Hudson was terrified and stayed silent for decades, but the podcast gave her the courage to finally tell the truth. She wasn't the only one. Lambert's work also pulled the curtain back on Paul's predatory behavior in the years after he left Cal Poly. For years, Paul had been a ghost in the South Bay area of Los Angeles, but the podcast found women who knew him by a different name. Chester the Molester. They described a man who would watch women from the corners of bars and follow them to their cars. The podcast also brought forward Jane Does, women who had horrific encounters with Paul in the 2010s. When the search warrants were finally served at Paul's home in San Pedro in 2021, the evidence was a blow to the gut. Police found a hard drive labeled Practice that was filled with videos of Paul raping and sodomizing women who appeared to be unconscious. They found date rape drugs. They found a search history that was a roadmap of a predator's mind, including searches for drugged and raped while passed out. Chris Lambert didn't just tell a story, he moved the needle. He shared his sources with the sheriff's office and coordinated with them so they could interview witnesses before he did. It was a level of cooperation that is rare in this field. By the time the police were ready to move, the community was already behind them, demanding that the authorities finally finish what they started in '96. The podcast didn't solve the case on its own, but it provided the oxygen the investigation needed to survive. It turned a cold case into a hot one. And in March of 2021, that momentum led to the biggest breakthrough in a quarter of a century. Law enforcement didn't just have a suspect anymore, they had a location. They headed to the quiet neighborhood of White Court in Arroyo Grande, and they brought a lot of shovels. The neighbors living on White Court in Arroyo Grande knew something big was happening the second they saw the black SUVs and white forensic vans rolling into their quiet cul-de-sac on that Tuesday morning in March of 2021. For years, the house at 710 White Court, the home of Ruben Flores, had been the subject of local whispers. People would drive by and point, wondering if the man inside was really helping his son hide a 19-year-old girl's body. But on this morning, the whispering stopped and the digging began. A massive task force of San Luis Obispo County sheriffs, deputies, FBI agents, and professional archaeologists descended on the property. They didn't just come with badges, they came with ground-penetrating radar and a very special canine named Amiga. As the radar moved across the backyard, it started picking up anomalies, places where the earth didn't look right. But when the team moved to the area beneath the large wooden deck attached to Ruben's house, everything changed. Archaeologists Philip Haynes and Cindy Arrington were kneeling in the dirt, carefully brushing away layers of soil. They weren't looking for a body anymore. They were looking for a ghost. They found a clandestine grave, a specific area of soil about the size of a human casket that had clearly been disturbed. You could still see the marks in the dirt where a shovel had once bitten into the earth. The soil in that specific spot was darker, stained with a biological discoloration that looked exactly like what happens when human remains decompose into the ground. But they didn't find bones. They didn't find hair. It looked like whatever had been buried there was gone. The prosecution's theory was that Ruben and Paul had realized the walls were closing in and had moved Kristin's remains to a new, secret location years earlier. But you can't just move a body and expect the earth to forget. The team brought out a chemical called Blue Star. It's a specialized forensic spray that reacts to blood, even blood that has been washed away or buried for decades. They sprayed it on the floor of a cargo trailer parked on the property and on the soil samples from beneath the deck. In the darkness under the deck, the soil began to emit a slow, blue glow. It was a visual confirmation that something horrific had happened in that dirt. This is where the story gets even more intense. If you're still with us, you're part of the elite true crime community. Make sure to share this video with one friend who needs to hear about this case. What's the weather like today where you are? Here on the Central Coast, it's a bit foggy, just like that night in '96. Let us know in the comments if you're a fan of this kind of deep dive storytelling. Those soil samples were rushed to a private lab in Richmond called the Serological Research Institute. A senior analyst named Angela Butler performed a test called HemDirect. This test is incredibly sensitive. It looks for human hemoglobin, the protein in our red blood cells. When the results came back, they were positive. Detective Clint Cole was the one who got the call from the lab. He was driving back to San Luis Obispo when his phone rang. He called Sheriff Ian Parkinson immediately. "Sheriff, are you sitting down?" he asked. When he delivered the news that they had found human blood in the soil at Ruben's house, Parkinson described it as an epiphany moment. After 25 years of dead ends and lost earrings, they finally had physical evidence that linked a dead body to the Flores family. They also found something else in the soil: strange, multicolored fibers. The prosecution believed these fibers could have come from the clothing Kristin was wearing or a tarp used to wrap her body. It was enough. The evidence was finally heavy enough to tip the scales. On April 13th, 2021, the world finally got the update it had been waiting for. Paul Flores was arrested at his home in San Pedro, and his father, Ruben, was taken into custody in Arroyo Grande. Paul was charged with first-degree murder. Ruben was charged as an accessory for helping hide the remains. Think about the look on Paul's face as the handcuffs clicked shut. For 25 years, he had lived as a free man. He had gone to bars, worked jobs, and even continued his predatory behavior against other women, all while knowing that Kristin's blood was literally soaking into the ground beneath his father's deck. He thought he was smarter than the law. He thought the fog of '96 would hide him forever. But the earth eventually gave up its secrets. As we move into the trial, we're going to look at how a Monterey County jury reacted to these findings, and the brave women who stood up to tell the world who Paul Flores really was. The trial the Central Coast had been waiting for since 1996 didn't actually happen in San Luis Obispo. Because the case had been the main thing everyone talked about for over 2 decades, finding 12 people who hadn't already made up their minds was basically impossible. So, in the summer of 2022, the whole legal circus moved north to the Salinas Valley in Monterey County. Judge Jennifer O'Keefe was running a courtroom setup that was as rare as it was complicated. There were 2 separate juries sitting in the same room. One jury was there only to decide the fate of Paul Flores, the man charged with first-degree murder. The other 12 people were there for his father, Ruben, who was facing charges for being an accessory after the fact. It was a logistical mess. Every time a piece of evidence came up that was only legally allowed to be heard by one jury, the other group had to be marched out of the room. The prosecution, led by Christopher Puvrell, knew they were climbing a mountain. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a murder weapon. What they had was a 26-year trail of lies and a pattern of predatory behavior that was about to be laid out for the whole world to see. The most emotional moments of the 3-month trial came when the Jane Does took the stand. These were women who had no connection to the events of 1996, but they knew who Paul Flores really was. 2 women, known to the court as Rhonda Doe and Sarah Doe, gave graphic, heart-wrenching testimony. They described meeting Paul at bars in Redondo Beach and San Pedro in the 2010s. They told the juries a story that sounded way too familiar. They described feeling strangely drunk or out of it after only having 1 or 2 drinks given to them by Paul. They talked about blacking out and then waking up in Paul's bed while he was raping them. Sarah Doe actually pointed Paul out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had stolen her safety. Her testimony was so heavy that multiple jurors were seen wiping away tears, and Judge O'Keefe had to call for a break so everyone could get it together. The prosecution's argument was clear. Paul didn't just happen to be the last person seen with Kristin. He was a hunter. He used his image as a college student to target women who were vulnerable, and Kristin Smart was simply his first victim. If you're still with us, you're part of the true crime community that cares about the facts. This is the part of the story where the evidence finally starts to catch up with the lies. I've got to ask, what's the weather like today where you are? It's a clear day here, but the details of this trial are enough to put a heavy weight in any room. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Then came the practice hard drive. During a search of Paul's home in San Pedro, investigators found a drive that was essentially a record of his crimes. The prosecution showed the jury a screenshot from one of the videos. It was a photo of a woman with a bright red ball gag in her mouth. Pouvrel looked at the jury and asked if that looked like consent. He used those images to bridge the gap between the 19-year-old student from 1996 and the serial predator of the 2010s. The defense, led by Robert Sanger, didn't give up without a fight. He made 9 different motions for a mistrial. He called the prosecution's case a conspiracy theory fueled by a podcast. He attacked the soil evidence from beneath Ruben's deck, bringing in experts who claimed the tests for human blood weren't reliable because the pH levels of the dirt hadn't been checked. He even tried to suggest that Kristin might still be alive, that she was a troubled girl who had just walked away. On October 18, 2022, the tension in the Salinas courthouse was thick. The verdicts were ready. Paul's jury went first. The clerk read the words that the Smart family had waited over 26 years to hear. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Stan and Denise Smart finally took a breath. There were no cheers, only silent tears, but the victory was bittersweet. Just a few minutes later, Ruben's jury announced their verdict: not guilty. Even though the blood was in the soil beneath his deck, the jury didn't feel there was enough proof that Ruben knew he was helping hide a body. Ruben walked out of the courtroom a free man, while his son was led away in handcuffs. The final act of the trial took place on March 10, 2023. Judge Jennifer O'Keefe didn't hold back during the sentencing. She looked Paul Flores in the eye and called him a cancer to society. She sentenced him to 25 years to life in state prison, the maximum sentence allowed. She told him he deserved to spend every single day he had left behind bars. The man who walked Kristin into the fog was finally being held accountable, but the battle wasn't over. They still didn't have their daughter. In March of 2023, the hallway outside the Monterey County courtroom was silent as a tomb. After 27 years of waiting, of searching, and of being told to just move on, Stan and Denise Smart were about to see the end of the line. Inside, Judge Jennifer O'Keefe didn't mince words. She looked Paul Flores right in the eyes, the same eyes that witnesses said went dead when he talked about Kristin, and she called him exactly what he was: a cancer to society. She sentenced him to 25 years to life in state prison, the absolute maximum the law would allow. For the first time since that foggy night in 1996, Paul Flores wasn't going home to his mother's house or his apartment in San Pedro. He was headed to a cell. But in the true crime world, the gavel hitting the wood is rarely the final chapter. Paul spent the next 2 years using every legal loophole he could find to claw his way back to freedom. His legal team filed a massive appeal that hit the California 2nd Appellate District in late 2025. This wasn't just a simple request for a new trial. It was an all-out assault on the 2022 proceedings. They claimed the whole trial was a media circus fueled by the Your Own Backyard podcast. But the weirdest part of the appeal focused on a woman known as Juror 273. During the original trial, when archaeologists were describing the dark biological stains in the dirt beneath Ruben's deck, Juror 273 had a visible emotional breakdown. She started crying and had to be consoled by other jurors. The defense argued this proved she was biased and had lost her ability to remain neutral. They claimed she had even spoken to a bailiff, admitting she finally saw Paul's guilt. Paul's lawyers also fought to have the testimony of the Jane Does thrown out. They argued that bringing up Paul's later crimes, the drugging and raping of women in the 2010s, was just a way to make the jury hate him, rather than proving he killed Kristin. They even went after the witnesses like Trevor Bolter, claiming his opinion that Kristin looked roofied at the party was nothing more than inadmissible gossip. On October 24, 2025, the appellate court handed down its decision. They weren't buying it. They ruled that jurors aren't robots and that an emotional reaction to evidence of a shallow grave is a human response, not a sign of legal bias. They upheld the conviction, stating that the evidence was more than enough for any reasonable person to conclude that Paul killed Kristin during an attempted rape. A second appeal was slapped down just weeks later, on November 20th, 2025. While the legal battle was raging, life inside prison was proving to be its own kind of nightmare for Paul. He was initially sent to Pleasant Valley State Prison in Coalinga, but he didn't last long in the general population. In August of 2023, he was jumped in the yard and slashed across the neck with a prison-made blade. His attacker was no stranger to violence. It was Jason Boudreau, a man already serving life for killing his girlfriend and his cellmate, the infamous I-5 Strangler. Paul was airlifted to a hospital in serious condition. He survived, but after a second attack just months later, the state decided he was a liability. He was transferred to Corcoran State Prison, a high-security facility that once housed Charles Manson. As of today, he is serving his time there, a marked man in a place where people don't take kindly to those who target young women. But the Smarts aren't done yet. In January of 2024, they launched a brand new legal war. They filed a massive civil lawsuit against Cal Poly. This suit is personal. It alleges that the university knew Paul Flores was a predator long before Kristin ever stepped foot on campus. It points to at least 5 separate reports from other women who said Paul was stalking them, peeping into their windows, and harassing them in the dorms. The family's argument is simple. If the school had done its job in 1995 and kicked Paul off campus, Kristin would be a 48-year-old woman today. In May of 2023, the university president, Jeffrey Armstrong, issued a public apology to the family. He admitted the school had failed them. But for Denise and Stan, an apology 27 years late is just words. They are looking for the full investigative file, the secrets the university has kept locked away since the 90s. As we look toward the future of this case, the courtroom battles might be winding down, but the search for the one thing that matters most is still very much alive. As we look at where this case stands in late 2025, the bottom line is that the cell door has finally slammed shut on Paul Flores. He is tucked away in the high-security blocks of Corcoran State Prison, serving 25 years to life. But for the Smart family, the victory feels incomplete. There is a hole in this story that no amount of legal rulings can fill. Kristin Smart has never been found. Even after the guilty verdict, even after the failed appeals, the Flores family has refused to give up the one thing that matters most, the location of Kristin's remains. The prosecution believes she was moved from beneath that deck in Arroyo Grande years ago. They think Paul and Ruben still hold that secret like a trump card, a final act of control over a family they have already put through nearly 30 years of hell. In June of 2024, a California judge tried to hit Paul where it hurts his wallet. He was ordered to pay over $350,000 in restitution to Stan and Denise Smart. It was meant to cover the costs of their 27-year search, But everyone knows Paul doesn't have that kind of money. It's a symbolic gesture, a legal "I owe you" that will likely never be paid. But the fight for accountability has shifted to a new front. The Smarts are now taking on the institution that they believe allowed this predator to thrive. Their civil lawsuit against Cal Poly is moving through the courts right now, and the allegations are enough to make your blood boil. The suit claims the university had at least 5 separate reports of Paul Flores stalking and harassing women before he ever met Kristin. They say the school knew he was climbing trellises to peep into windows and cornering girls in the dorms. The family's argument is straightforward. If the school had just done its job and kicked the Chester the molester off campus in 1995, Kristin would be a middle-aged woman today, probably traveling the world as the architect she dreamed of being. In May of 2023, the university president, Jeffrey Armstrong, finally stood up and apologized. He admitted the school failed, but for the Smarts, that apology came 27 years too late to save their daughter. They want the full files. They want to know every single thing the university kept hidden in the shadows of the 90s. Despite the tragedy, Kristin's legacy is everywhere. If you walk onto a public college campus in California today, you are protected by the Kristin Smart Campus Security Act of 1998. Because of her, schools can't just sit on missing person reports for 4 days while evidence goes cold. Her name is literally written into the safety protocols of an entire state. Back in her hometown of Stockton, there is a bench at Lincoln High School dedicated to her memory. It's a place where students sit and talk about their futures, the same kind of future that was stolen from Kristin. Her family has also set up a scholarship in her name, aimed at helping young women who want to study architecture or criminal justice. They want to turn her stolen dreams into opportunities for others. Kristin wasn't just a face on a billboard. She was a girl who loved the ocean. She was a camp counselor in Hawaii who spent her summers teaching kids how to swim. She was a traveler who became fluent in Spanish while living in Venezuela. She was vibrant, she was stubborn, and she was loved. The man who took her life thought he could make her disappear, but he was wrong. He only made her immortal. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Kristin Smart investigation. It's a story of resilience that reminds us why we do what we do here at Cold Case Files. If you found this narrative moving, please share it. Every view keeps Kristin's name alive and maintains the pressure on those who still hold her secrets. Before you head out, I have one last question for you. Do you think Paul Flores or his father will ever have a change of heart and reveal where Kristin is buried? Let's get a conversation going in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And this has been Cold Case Files. We'll see you in the next investigation.